Countries in Africa are expelling Western military forces. What's behind that move and how will that impact the region? Hello, I'm Chad and Niger and this is The Heat. African countries in the Sahel region have asked Western forces to withdraw. Burkina-Faso, Mali, Chad and Niger have expelled the French military, and now Chad and Niger have revoked security pacts with the Americans. CGTN's Robert Nagila takes a look at events leading up to this and the possible impact on the regional fight against insurgencies.
Hundreds of protesters marched through Niger's capital, Niamey, demanding the withdrawal of U.S. troops from their country. Niger's military government ended its military pact with the United States.
We've come here to support the CNSP and to say no to the American military base. We don't want Americans on our territory.
Although we are a partner of France and NATO, we don't have the freedom to buy the weapons we want, even with our own money.
Experts say the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Niger is likely to have far-reaching ramifications on operations against militants in the region. The U.S. has its forces in Niger since 2013 and has about 1,000 troops in the country. Last year, France completed the withdrawal of its troops from Niger following a similar demand.
This is a big blow. I mean, the U.S. did not expect this to happen. Principally, the anti-French sentiment was attributed specifically to the French. But all of a sudden, the U.S. finds itself in a situation where it is following the footsteps of France in quitting Niger.
Foreign forces in the region have often been accused of being ineffective against a growing insurgency in the Sahel. Neighboring Chad is now threatening to end its military pact with the United States, having also kicked out French troops.
They had demanded, that the U.S. justifies its operation by providing some sort of documentation, but they did fail to do that. And consequently, that has led to the Chadian government asking the U.S. to withdraw its operations.
The U.S. announcement follows the arrival of Russian military advisors in Niger. The country's military government joins Chad and Mali in signing new defense cooperation agreements with Russia. Robert Nagila, CGTN.
There is a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our panelists. From Kampala in Uganda, Joseph Ochieno is a writer and commentator on African affairs. Here in Washington, D.C., Abduallahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. Also in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And from Virginia, Michael Maloof is a former Pentagon senior security policy analyst. Welcome to all of you. Joseph Ochieno, as we've just heard, there are several West African countries, among them Mali, Chad, Niger, that are now asking Western troops to leave. Most of those troops in West Africa are French troops, but as we also just heard, there's a sizable number of American troops in the region as well. What's behind this? Why is it happening now, and why so many countries at the same time?
I think from my perspective, it's not particularly surprising, considering the 30, 40 years of the manner in which the U.S. operated on the African continent. When I was coming to your show, I was just giving myself a thought about the Southern African struggles, anti-apartheid struggles at the time, when the anti-apartheid campaigners were backing the Cuban forces in Angola, but the South African forces were deeply rooted in Angola at the time and backed by the U.S. Fast forward beyond that, if you consider what is happening in the Sahel, away really from the jihadists and away really from the question of the Russian involvement, there is a very difficult question to ask on whether or not there has been any significant attempt by Western forces on the African continent to push not only for the stability of the African continent, but rather basically to occupy, and if not to occupy in this case, in many cases, perhaps to control. So there are actually substantial neo-colonial nuances, and with the emergence of these military regimes that seek to question, if you like, the colonial and historical perspective, if you like, of the colonial operations and occupations of those very particular nation states, particularly the Sahel, in this case, granted, sparked off by the anti-French sentiments. It's actually not surprising that many more questions have arisen beyond these military guys, but across the African continent, particularly amongst the academicians, and indeed the youth organizations on this continent. So it's possibly not surprising, but in any case, I'm not quite sure whether the US handled it very well in the more recent time. Don't forget, there was this threat thing of a stick rather than stick and carrot. And these military regimes seem to have been underestimated, except only to turn out that, look, actually, these guys did not only have the popularity, but the sentiment in terms of their languages, the emotions that they're invoking, seem to be rather sensible, seem to be rather commonsensical, regardless of whether or not they basically mean very much long-term for the African continent.
Abduallahi, both the United States and France say that their troops are in the region to combat religious extremism there. Here is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed. This is what she had to say about that. Let's watch.
The epicenter of terrorism has shifted from the Middle East and North Africa into sub-Saharan Africa, concentrated largely in the Sahel region.
When she say that the epicenter has shifted, to what extent is that true? And if it is, how successful have Western nations been in combating extremism in that region?
Thank you so much, Anton. I think what you asked my colleague Ochieno, what is behind the anti-French, anti-American, anti-Western sentiment? If the main primary reason for why these forces are there, it's not been very clear, it's been argued, and it's like almost a legend that that is what they are doing, I think they have not done a good job. And so, in any case, some of the young leaders who have come through, most of them through the change of power from civilian to military, are feeling the pressure from the ground. And people are asking, sure, these guys can stay. We've had now, since, the counterterrorism has become the primary lens of looking at the African continent, then they have not done a good job. So the leaders are primarily responding to what the ground is asking of them. Of course, they are over-essentializing it for their own regime survival. I think my reckoning is that the United States, and especially the Western countries, they are consistent looking at African continent as a problem to be solved rather than opportunities. I think therein lies a lot of their problem. Just for instance, what would 1,000 special forces do? What would the 700 or 100 that are in Chad do? I think we need to be realistic that, you're going to solve such a deep-rooted problem by just using the use of force, I beg your pardon, to resolve this. I think just shows the short term.
Yeah.
And therefore, we're not surprised we're here where we are now.
Abduallahi, as you say, they've not been very successful in combating extremism in the region, but perhaps that is not their major reason for being there. Would it perhaps be to protect their interests, especially the extraction of vital minerals from that region?
Precisely. I think I actually, whenever this subject comes up, I actually say superimpose on the American and Western military bases on the continent what the Chinese are doing. Americans and Western countries, like I said, they are looking at Africa as a problem to be solved, and therefore the only language that, to their mind, this problem understands is the use of military force. So they've established military bases and military pacts with majority of these countries, sometimes including in Niger and Chad, at the expense of their rhetoric around human rights and development and all other stuff. But if you look at the military base, superimpose on that large-scale infrastructure projects, transnational railways, and all that the Chinese are doing, it is then little wonder that there is a resentment towards a purely kinetic way of solving what is really a deep-rooted problem. But just looking at it, it's the same with migration that we had a conversation about it. So I think for the United States and others, when you're building a drone base using over 100 million What would 100 million do to Niger, a country that is really desperate if you look at all development indicators?
Right. Anton, Fedyashin, some of these countries that we're talking about, they're now welcoming Russian forces into their countries. And these Russian forces also include military instructors. There is a group, a Russian group known as the Africa Corps, which is very closely linked to the mercenary group Wagner. What can you tell us about Russia's presence in the region?
Well, the Russians seem to be moving in force on by invitation, and the government in Moscow has very successfully played to the best memories that many Africans have of the Cold War days, which are not known for good memories, by the way, in most parts. But last summer, when there was a summit of African leaders in Russia, Putin spoke of sort of the unfortunate post-Soviet neglect that the Russians basically turned to Africa. They turned away. They turned westwards, and they neglected a whole continent. And now that there's a proxy war going on in Ukraine against Russia, now that the Russians have been sanctioned more than any country in the history of our species on this planet, they're looking elsewhere. Their presence in the Sahel is primarily military right now, because that's the simplest way to insert yourself into a region, and again, by invitation. The question is whether they will follow up economically. We will see, but I think that there's a grander strategy going on in Africa, and I think it has to do with the Russians and the Chinese actually cooperating. The Russians seem to be inserting themselves militarily and fulfilling the mission that the French and the Americans had done before. The Chinese are coming in, as my interlocutors just noted very correctly, with the economic component, as are the Russians, but also to a much smaller degree. Will this work? We'll have to see, but it sounds like the Africans have made a conscious decision to move away from the West and to try something different.
Michael Maloof, regarding the strategic balance of power in this particular region, I mean, when we talk about the fact that these countries have asked Western forces to leave in general, the Americans as well, how much of a setback is that?
Well, it's a major setback for the United States as it sees ISIS and Al-Qaeda linking up with local groups in the particularly in the Sahel area, and how can the United States then maintain a position and an ability to deal with, as one of your other folks said earlier, the shift from the Middle East to Africa now, and we're seeing this more and more. But it's very interesting what's happened here is that there's been a repudiation by the new leadership in all of these countries in the Sahel to get rid of the Western dominance that they've been living under all these times. They represent anti-colonialism. This is the new spirit that has driven this. And ironically, neither Russia nor China have a history of being colonial powers. In fact, they were subject to colonialism themselves, particularly China. And as a result, they also know they need help. Let's just take France, for example. It was kicked out of Mali. What did this do to its capability of finding new nuclear resources for its own generation, nuclear generation? That's been a problem for them. And I think that when you see it, France, in fact, is so upset with the Russians that's probably why you're hearing Macron now talking about moving French troops into Ukraine in response. It's unsaid, but that seems to be what is going on in a reaction, because it's been a real body blow to France in terms of access to resources before. So this is a very fluid situation. And it really is going to depend upon how China and Russia work with these new governments, this new generation that is now looking ahead to put themselves into a whole new independent light away from their colonial and barriers that they had before. So this is a very dynamic period, I think.
Abduallahi, this appears to sort of harken back to the Cold War days, doesn't it? Because we had a situation during the Cold War where the Cold War was being fought between Moscow and Washington, but there was an actual real hot war being forced in African countries. I mean, why are African countries not calling for all foreign troops to get out of their countries?
I think many cannot do. Many of the regimes are really intertwined with the Western powers, and so they cannot do, especially when they are reliant on their regime survival, on particularly the French, in especially Sahelian region and in some Central African region. But what you see in many of these governments, that whether it's in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, now Chad, these are fairly young leaders that are not necessarily beholden to the old ways of doing things. The old ways of doing things where, you know, everything on the surface looks like it's been done in their home countries, in Abidjan, in Chad, in Mali and Senegal, when in reality that is just a choreography. Most of the things are done in France, and France, Africa. I think it's that corrosive consequences is what we are seeing. For others that are completely reliant on France, on Western countries, they are not going to pull the plug yet. But two dynamic processes that are going on simultaneously in the region. One is this coup contagion that we are seeing, where most of the civilian leaders are being overthrown and military leaders are coming in, and subsequently this generates, because or in spite of it, anti-Western sentiment, which then drives the consequences of, you know, Western countries being pushed out. But I just want to say one final thing, Anton, if you allow me. The reality is we should be very careful not to embrace the coup leaders, as it were, because what you really do not want is coup leaders that only respond to the civilians and the citizens' cries when it suits them staying in power. Because what the last 20 years, what we've seen is on the continent, there has been tremendous amount of, you know, development because of the kind of nascent democratic forces that needs to be nurtured. If they continue to retain the anti-Western rhetoric, not all of it, especially around military bases, and then continue to nurture, you know, transition to democracy and good governance, they will actually reap the benefit and create a win-win situation for themselves.
Joseph Ochieno, Michael Maloof was talking a moment ago about these countries being sources of very, very vital metals, minerals. He talked about gold for one. There's uranium in Niger as well. Can you give us a sense of how important this region is economically, especially its natural resources?
It's extremely important. In fact, I really got quite surprised that it took us this long for the continent and indeed African leaders, regardless of their background, waking up to the reality in terms of the response by which the military guys have, if you like, responded to France. I must say, as an activist of very many years against militarists and actually pro-democracy activists, that for the first time in a long time, I may have told your program before, that I felt nearly persuaded by the language, not necessarily persuaded or pushed by these guys, but by the languages that they were speaking. Because as I said, I think to consider how much, particularly France and in the Francophone concept, has worked to exploit the continent. Sometimes it's almost as if you're reading stories, biblical stories of 2,000 years ago, but these are realities that were happening up to and including possibly last year. So I think it's important. But that said, really, I'm not quite sure whether as a continent we have woken up sufficiently to be much more organized enough to be able to make the best use of resources. Of course, here we're talking about the Sahel. But if you move closer to me here and you see what's going on in the neighboring Congo and you see what's happening in neighboring Sudan, there is a huge amount of resource exploitation, predominantly by foreign forces, and in many cases done rather informally, and normally with some few African agents at the expense of the vast majority of the citizens of this continent. It almost sort of doesn't matter whether or not, in this case, we've stopped seeing France or the US or the Europeans doing it. But I must say very quickly also that I think, in part for the reason given, that most of the leaders outside the Sahel seem to be rather too much beholden to Western powers and Western interests, thanks really to their colonial narratives and colonial scripts. If it was not the case, ordinary feelings, and I travel reasonably around these places, and most of the people, particularly the emergent elite, post-neoliberal agenda and neoliberal questions, with the burdens that are facing the continent at this moment, I think there would be much more harsher position against the West.
Anton, there are some very senior U.S. officials who are saying that there may be some benefits for these countries who are changing their allegiance to Russia in the short term, but still in the long term they will not get, these officials say, the same benefits, economic benefits, development benefits that they're getting from Western countries. Firstly, is that true?
Well, Anand, the list of Chinese infrastructural projects that have been unfolding in Africa over the past 20 years, when you compare them to what Western countries have brought, and I mean specifically infrastructural projects, factories, railroads, stuff like that, there really is no comparison. The United States and France were working on a security paradigm. They were building bases and providing security, anti-terrorism measures, and an absolute minimum economic investment came along with that. The Chinese are doing something different, and the Russians are also moving in both with security assistance and economically. So economically, the long-term benefits seem better on the Sino-Russian side than they have been on the Western side. Now, how long this will last is an open question, but the West has had its chance, and the Africans have turned elsewhere. It is ultimately Africa's decision, and I understand how, for many Africans, the anti-colonial narrative resonates with the history of the 20th century, when it was the socialist camp that supported the anti-colonial struggle across the entire continent, from the north in the heady days of Nasser and the Algerian struggle against the French, all the way down to Angola and to South Africa. So let's see what happens. But it looks like this, what we're seeing in the Sahel today is really part of a much broader de-Westernization phenomenon, which is sweeping our planet and doesn't seem to me to show any signs of slowing down. Quite the contrary, it seems to be picking up.
Michael Maloof, Chad has asked American troops to leave that country, but that doesn't seem to be the end of it. In fact, there are negotiations that are continuing, talks that are continuing to allow some of those U.S. troops to return. So the United States is determined to have a presence in this part of Africa. Why is the U.S. so determined to have that presence?
Because it wants to maintain a strategic positioning in the Sahel. That is a very critical belt, if you will. And also, when you look at where all of the terrorist activities have been underway, that area is prime. The United States today, believe it or not, has some 30-odd small bases sprinkled around Africa for primarily special operations types, and this would be a jolt if they're taken out of their strategic positioning. But as others have stated, the U.S. has primarily been looking at the defensive rather than the economic benefits. And I think that the fact that even Russia has a military aspect to it, it's also part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's also part of that of the BRICS group that these countries now are going to be looking toward more and more for their own economic development and prosperity. And I think that this is where they're leaning toward for the future. and they ought to be, rather than just seeing what the United States brings in terms of just defensive type of activity, which only benefits just a few rather than the whole. So I think that we're going to be seeing, as I said earlier, some dynamic events occurring here in the very near future.
Abduallahi, we were talking a moment ago about the French connection with Africa, this policy known as Francoafrique. I mean, it's very, very extensive, isn't it? France has a great deal of interest in this part of Africa. In fact, for a long time, and to this day, the French central bank controls currencies in many of these countries. And but there is an acknowledgement that something needs to change. The former French president, Jacques Chirac, he admitted that at one time, much of France's wealth came from exploitation in these African countries, and that now needs to change. So how much of a change do you think there is in France about this relationship?
Rhetorically, there is an acknowledgement, but in terms of real sustainable policy shift, I don't see it near future. But the reality is, it's not whether France has the political will to do it. That is not in their hands anymore. The level of, at the very macro level of disintegration of post-Second World War order is very clear for everybody to see. I just want to highlight three things that will make that inevitable. Number one, once COVID struck, majority of Western countries that have been exhorting the notion of, collective agreement, collective, whatever happens in one part of the world affects everybody, they very quickly shut down and started denying something as simple as removing intellectual property rights for some of these countries to start manufacturing their own drugs. And many African countries have not forgotten that. Secondly, immediately the crisis in Ukraine hit, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, majority of Western countries were making a beeline to go and visit African countries, telling them to support Ukraine and not Russia. But for the last 2 years, over the two major conflicts has happened on the continent. One is in Sudan, and one is in Ethiopia. Yeah. In the Sudan crisis, the largest displacement that we've seen, nothing similar to the Ukraine has been rolled out in terms of receiving people. The third and final one is the ongoing conflict in Gaza, where South Africa took upon itself to take this case to the International Court of Justice. And this is revealing the true status of Western countries, the double standard, the hypocrisy of not sticking to what they mean. As a result, it's not up to the French whether they want it or not. They've had a good run, and that good run is coming to an end, whether they like it or not.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C.